Welcome everybody to this Nuts roadmap update titled Peanut and Friends. Peanut would be the next release name for the next version, although the planned features cannot be released in a single version, hence the Peanut and Friends. So we need some more Nuts names to continue our releases. Okay, so goal for this meeting is that we would like to lay out the revised roadmap, get feedback from you guys. So we scheduled for 90 minutes. I will not be talking for 90 minutes, so there's some time for you to ask questions on what is going on and how this will influence your developments and that kind of stuff. We can discuss the next steps and how to plan it in time. And hopefully we can also discuss some collaboration and how you can help us get these features into production. Okay, so the agenda for today. There's some reflection. Why are we doing this? And then we'll talk about the actual architectural changes. How we are going to do this, change this, do the migrations in the certain time allocated, which we don't know yet, but we'll discuss that at the end. Okay, so reflection. We started 4 years ago with the current version of the open source software. And in the meantime, a lot of things have happened. Most notably is that Europe is on the move and they selected a bunch of standards or standards specifications that want to be a standard that should be used to support identity wallets. That's the top list. Those are the standards that have been selected. A lot of those actually standardized things we came up with like 4 or 3 years ago. So it's a good choice for us to migrate towards those standards. There's also profiles. Most notably the decentralized identity interop profile, which select certain things from those standards, because if you follow those standards, you still don't have any interoperability unless you implement everything. So the profiles are important to do a sub-selection, especially for the different DID methods. Otherwise, you have to support like 100 different DID methods, which is not doable without a significant server farm. There have also been some working groups, I should say. And one of them was the multiple vendor working group. And what we saw there, or what we explored, was how can we reuse authorization credentials when multiple vendors provide services for the same care organization. What we noticed that it is possible, but it's very complex and hard to implement. So the easiest solution is actually use the same legal basis, that is the input for authorization credentials, and share that between the different vendors. So each Nuts node would issue the authorization credentials to each other Nuts node that should be using it. And then the question arises, why issue credentials if they can only be used and the issuer is the verifier? Because basically you can also just check your database. So this is a really important thing we noticed. So why do we still use Nuts authorization credentials? So that the path towards those authorization credentials was very logical, but if you design it from scratch, it's not that logical anymore. And there are some other issues that actually enforce the same conclusion. Okay, so if we look at the current technology in the Nuts node, there's some complexity involved, especially when trying to be backwards and forwards compatible. And the choice for different storage methods also means that the transaction model has some problems. And of course, there's a transactional model shared between all the nodes. So, of course, there are some good things about this model because consistency is achieved across all databases, which was one of the design goals. Unfortunately, it's all using non-generic technology. Based on what we've learned the last couple of years, and also from the working groups, is that there are some changes in functional and non-functional requirements. And there are some changes in which non-functional requirements have the most priority. And that, of course, influences the overall architecture and design. So if you look at the last bullet point, I think we now value interoperability with the different vendor infrastructure more than previous. So it's become more important to have a better integration with the vendor infrastructure. If we look at the node maintenance, so the current backup restore procedure is too difficult for our liking. There's also work involved with monitoring the logs. There's quite some output. I don't think that every vendor monitors the logs the same way. There's also some state monitoring that's mostly done by us. We're monitoring the different networks and trying to figure out if the consistency state is still okay across all nodes. So it's a bit of a high maintenance and low risk scenario. And we want to migrate towards a low maintenance and low risk scenario. And something we heard from different workshops is that creating your new node and having it join the network has some quirks and could be even simpler. Verifiable credentials. If you look at how they are used, then they should be in the wallet of the holder. So this model is the common model used for verifiable credentials. So there's an issuer, there's a holder, and verifier. I think for most of you, this is not any new information, but verifiable credentials should live in the wallet of the holder. And currently, we do different things with it. For example, publish public verifiable credentials over the network, which is a bit weird and shouldn't be done. Sticking to this model and using credentials only from a wallet makes it easier to adopt the newer standards and be way better in forward compatibility with all the things that are being created worldwide. So that's the end for the different reflection topics. I don't know, Ryan, is there any questions on the chat? And maybe some people want to ask a question about this reflection part before we go to the actual architectural changes. The question was, aren't Nuts authorization credentials also used as a publish subscribe mechanism to notify that data can be retrieved? I don't know what the answer is, but the main thing we see with the current use cases is that notification happens in let's say, user space, so on the functional level, and it's integrated with the information model and the functional design. So using it from the trust and security level would be discouraged when after these architectural changes have occurred, because it won't be available anymore. We haven't seen any use cases that actually use the Nuts authorization credential as notification mechanism. Okay, I'll continue. Okay, so architectural changes. If we look at the Nuts authorization credentials, the top view is the current situation, where a legal basis is the input for issuing a Nuts authorization credential to another node. That will change into a more OAuth based flow. I created a sequence diagram for this, which I will show in the next slide. Basically, your legal basis check will have to be done when requesting an access token, but also for each request. It will look something like this. It starts with a client, which is your XSACD, or the Nuts node from XSACD side, wanting to view the data, is that it should get a presentation definition. Presentation definitions are one of the new standards. It basically tells your wallet which credentials to select to create a verifiable presentation. So in the concepts, we ask for a presentation definition, which is retrieved from the resource owner. And basically, presentation definitions will be standardized for each use case. For example, in the e-overdracht, it would be listing a single verifiable credential, namely a Nuts organization credential. This presentation definition is returned to the client. The client, if it's a Nuts node, it will automatically select the correct verifiable credentials to create a verifiable presentation. This verifiable presentation is then sent to the other side, which can be verified also with the original presentation definition. And if everything is correct, an access token will be returned. With this access token, for example, file resource can be retrieved. After some token introspection by the AAA proxy, it can then talk to its policy backend. So this is a bit of a new concept. A lot of the information used to be in the Nuts authorization credentials, but not all. So each request has to be forwarded to this policy backend to see if this resource can be accessed with the access token that was requested. This is something that is probably maintained by you as a vendor. So the policy backend is something you have to create. And it's probably something that has to be created per use case. For example, for an e-overdracht, it's a pretty simple one. Each file resource that is requested should be listed in a database, because a composition for the e-overdracht is created with a list of specific resources. So each specific request can just be checked against a list of resources that are available. If there are other use cases, for example, a more generic Zorgenzage use case, then the policy backend should be a consent registry, which can be one of multiple. It can be local consent. It can also be something like MITs. And then the policy backend would be some kind of adapter that transforms this authorized request to a MITs via consent request. This policy backend should also enforce, for example, if you're requesting a single fire observation that corresponds to a patient where consent is actually given. And such a check is not able, it's currently not doable in a Nuts authorization credential. But at the time you're requesting the resource, you have all the necessary information to see if, for example, observation number 5 can actually be accessed by the client, because it corresponds to patient number 7, and patient number 7 has given consent for that authorization. So that happens at the policy backend or the policy decision point, and behind that there's a policy administration point. These policies, they should be registered per use case. So for example, the overdraft use case has a separate chapter which says something about authorization, and currently it says something about how the Nuts authorization credential should be created, but it should then list something about the available resources that can be accessed with the access token. There is a question.
We get a question from Jorrit.
Echo.
Jorrit asks, it looks like the actual authorization is now more being done just in time instead of beforehand when we issued an authorization credential. Is that the correct way to look at it?
Yes, this is true. So for more complex use cases, you already had to do this, because the Nuts authorization credential could not, for example, map specific observation or episode resources to a specific patient. So there should already be such a check if you have a more generic use case. There was another question. Is there a way to create machine readable policies? Yes, there's a standard for that. I believe it's called OPA or OPA in Dutch. So that's something that can be standardized. This is also, of course, a question, will such a policy backend be something that can be provided open source? One of the problems there is that the first component you probably have to create is a sort of a router policy backend, because not every one of your customers is probably paying for the same use case. So different customers probably have a different policy backend, or maybe not even supported for different for specific use cases. Okay, so this is quite a big change we're proposing here. We're already asking some vendors how they have currently stored, for example, information for the A overdraft. Do they have their own database where they store information about every A overdraft, or do they use the Nuts node as their primary storage for which A overdraft is authorized and which is not? Because if you have your own database, then creating such a policy backend would be much simpler. You just have to put an API on it, a specific API, and then you're ready to go. Right. Any questions on this part?
Yes. Does this align to any standards like SEALT, or is this just a flow that you developed by yourself or had to develop by yourself?
So the entire part for getting the access token would be based on OpenID for VP and COP optional.
All right.
So one of the slides further down the presentation also shows that in the flows, user participation in the flow is required, because those standards require something to go through the user agent or the browser.
So up to getting the file resource is all COP, basically.
Yeah, so it's basically a combination of OpenID for PP and COP. One of the things we can do, and this is also in the presentation definition standard and in the OpenID for VP standard, is although you can get like a single presentation definition, you can then create multiple verifiable presentations. So for example, one from the vendor, one from the care organization, and one from the user. And those combined would fulfill the requirements of that presentation definition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you can stack multiple wallets and get different credential attestations from different wallets.
Yep.
Right. The registry. Like I said earlier, verifiable credentials should live in the wallet and not in the wild. And our current registry, we basically published verifiable credentials just to know which organizations were there, and then we combined the available organization credentials with the service definitions from the DoD documents, which are currently also published on the network, to know which care organization is available for which use case. So it also corresponds with the DITman API, which you use for searching the combination of organization name and service. Because we don't want organization credentials published anymore, and because what the later slide says, we want to change the DoD method, and thus the network will probably be removed. We need a different way to know who is which care organization is available for which use case. We came up with something new, which is called a use case list. Working title, if someone has a better name, then that's okay. And a use case list is a very simple mechanism. For each use case, you have to pick a controller, which can be any organization with a Nuts node. And you have to create a presentation definition for the use case, which can also include any party that should be trusted for that use case. For example, an overdraft presentation definition would just be listing the Nuts organization credential. And it would say that the issuers of Nuts organization credentials should be one of those DIDs in the list, and each DID in the list would correspond to one of the vendors that is servicing the overdraft. A client configures the controller URL, the same presentation definition, so that this presentation definition is something that should be in use case documents, and something like, oh, do we still have to do a DoD document resolve and check required services? So the part between question marks, we don't know yet if that's required. We'll have to see how it works. Because when using a presentation definition, clients can now automatically create a verifiable presentation for every wallet they own. So as a vendor, if you have like 10 customers that have joined a specific use case based on that presentation definition, you can automatically create verifiable presentations. And a client will post this verifiable presentation to the configured URL. Clients will also request changes from this controller periodically. And you get deltas like who left the use case, who joined the use case, etc., etc. Client and controller will both check the verifiable presentation according to the commonly registered presentation definition, and clients will index the downloaded verifiable presentations. So the entire registry mechanism we have right now will be changed by a simple get and post API, where still signatures will be checked. I see Tim has a question. Is the controller a single instance? Who runs the instance? Yes, it is a single instance. Basically, who controls the use case? For example, the different couples could be the parties that have the controller. You could also just select one of the vendors as controller. And if like 9 of 10 vendors that participate in a use case do not agree how the controller is acting, they can just choose a new controller. Verifiable presentations are uploaded automatically each day, for example. So such a use case list would be recreated with a different controller very easily. Both clients and controller will check the signatures. So each node, Tim asks another question. So each node can also have a controller role. Yes, that could be possible. So for the AO overdraft use case, it could be controller A, and maybe for a Baby Connect use case, it could be a controller B, or maybe even the same. If there's, for example, a dedicated Nuts node that does this kind of work. You could also add a specific verifiable use case verifiable credential. So if you need some kind of receipt that a specific care organization and vendor combination implement a use case correctly and they get a verifiable credential to prove it, you could just add that verifiable credential to the presentation definition. And then only parties that have been audited can join the use case. Polling for change. Jorrit Spee asks a question. Polling for changes in what interval? Is this interval defined in the use case definition? Basically, we're just writing the RFC for the use case list. Basically, it has all the headers to perform caching. It also has a tombstone list to know which parties have left the use case or have abandoned the use case. So failing to upload or post a verifiable presentation for like 3 to 7 days will automatically get you booted from the use case because your server has gone offline and you didn't bother to remove your tenant from the use case. What we calculated is if you have a use case where 5,000 care organizations have joined, you probably get a new one every minute. And each request to the use case list endpoint would give you a no changes result in between. So it should be very quick and should be very lightweight. The result of this downloaded list will be indexed by the node. So what the presentation definition should contain is data that can be indexed, like the organization name, for example. Okay, next change. Currently, verifiable credential issuance is using the Nuts network, or if you're using one of the newest versions and you have a exposed public URL, it can also issue verifiable credentials directly between nodes using OpenID for VCI. In the new situation, OpenID for VCI will be the only mechanism used for issuance. Also remind that there won't be any Nuts authorization credentials, so any verifiable credential that will be issued to your Nuts node wallet will actually come from a issuer like CWG or an auditing party or actual parties that issue credentials and where also a user is involved. So for example, someone representing the organization has to log in somewhere, approve that the software they are using is actually used by a certain organization, and the result of that will be an issued credential to your Nuts Node wallet. So the number of credentials in your Nuts Node wallet will be very slim. We're also going to use the World Wide Web Consortium Status List 2021 for revocation. So basically what you will see is that a verifiable credential will have a few additional fields in there which list the endpoint where you can download the status list and your identifier, which is the index in the status list. A W3C status list works as a long binary list where each bit index is 0 or 1, and it says 0 is not revoked and 1 is revoked. And of course, this mechanism has to be supported by all parties that issue credentials. So if a Nuts node is issuing credentials, it will automatically support it. If there's another party that issues credentials based on OpenID for VC, it should also support the W3C status list 2021. But this is also one of the standards that has been selected for different interoperability profiles. And it has also been selected by the European Union for the EIDAS-2 framework. Okay, another important change, the DID method. One of the consequences of using the OpenID for VC family of standards is that there's more user interaction, right? For example, OpenID for VP, but also OpenID for VCI require certain parts of the protocol to go through the user agent. And also more involvement by wallets. And of course, the most of the first generation of wallets will be based on mobile phones. This also means that the DID method we're using should be resolvable by a mobile wallet and also by issuers that do not use a Nuts node. If we look at the different profiles that are being drawn up, you actually see two main DID methods being used everywhere, and that's DID web and DID JWK. For a DID web, you only need a publicly resolvable web address. For those of you that are already running the newest version of the Nuts node, you are already exposing all your DID documents as DID web, in case you didn't know. DID JWK would then be used by the mobile phones, because a DID JWK is a method where the actual public key is in the identifier. In a practical sense, changes to your configuration. Given all the previous architectural changes, there is no longer use for the gRPC network. Everything that involves network configuration will be removed. Everything involving port forwards to 5555 is no longer needed. And everything will be replaced by the public URL. This also means that you can just start your config with a valid public URL, and then your Nuts configuration will be valid. And you don't have to restart during workshops or onboarding. The public URL is very important because that will be the main part of your identity. All the DIDs from your tenants will be prefixed by this public URL. Also, it will be listed in the trust configuration of the presentation definitions. So it will become more easy to actually see which vendors should be trusted for a certain use case. Because, of course, a web URL is more easy to read than a DID with just public key information. And because the web is bound to the web URL, you can also do some manual checks, because a lot of the information about the DID document should be publicly accessible, and most of it is listed under the well-known path. So using a simple browser could already show you who is behind a certain DID. I think this is the last change. One of the functional requirements involves the current databases we're using. But as you have seen in the past few slides, because we are removing the network, we are removing the notion of transactions, and we have no longer any use for hash-based key value storage. So up to now, the databases we selected are very efficient in storing key values. But that will not be needed anymore. Also, if we look at the integration with different vendors, we see that almost all vendors are using some kind of cloud platform, like Azure or Google Cloud, or maybe even Amazon. So the question arose, why not use a simple SQL database? Because getting a Postgres MySQL database in Azure or Google Cloud is just a single click. And then you also have managed your backup procedures. Also, given the fact that we no longer have any use for storing key values, but we can use relational databases, it would make the actual use technology in a Nuts node very simple. So this is probably the last change we'll implement, the migration from the databases to an SQL database. It will still be possible to just start up a node. It will probably use something like SQLite to store everything on your disk. But with the same effort, you can just select your cloud SQL database. So this will probably be the latest change we'll implement. Okay, so this has been a long list of changes. Are there any questions I missed? Rijn, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we had some discussions more in detail on the use case list. Jorrit asked, and Tim asked as well, so like how often should you poll, who defines it? Well, the goal is to have a use case definition, which is developed together with the bolt or the source to passing, and the use case definition provides parameters such as who is a controller, how often should you poll, how long can verifiable presentations be valid, which credential issuers who you trust, etc., etc. And Jorrit asked are there any extra requirements involved using 3D web regarding security? The primary security measure of 3D web is TLS, so you need to have a trusted certificate on your domain or for your domain. So and there are like 120 plans for signing the 3D web document because the 3D patent doesn't specify it or support it. So yeah, it has a current state of the 3D web. That there are other HTTP based 3D patents in making, but yeah, those are involved or like in the making, and 3D web is yeah, it's out there. So that's why we settled on 3D web for now. And note that having a TAD web or private key is associated with the TAD, like it isn't the only thing you need to like exchange data, because if you want to exchange medical data, there always needs to be a person involved as well. So you always need more key material than just the DAD. So that's any more questions regarding that?
Yeah, so in addition to what I just told you, the primary reason to select DoD Web is that most of the interoperability profiles are basically listing it as the preferred way. Oh, there's a typo here, I see in 0.4. If you look at the security of DoD Web, there's of course something involved with DNS. So you probably have to do DNS over HTTPS, but that's something for the clients to do. And we're using this in server-to-server communication. And we're assuming that most of the servers and the software you as a vendor use are up to date and use the latest security patches and everything. Resolving a DoD web could be a problem. For example, if you're doing it from your mobile phone and your mobile phone is not up to date. So there's a problem, but then the question is, are you going to retrieve verifiable credentials on a public Wi-Fi network, or are you going to do that from your employer? One of the last security problems could be if you host a DoD web document just as a single file on your web server, then an attacker might be able to add a public key to that DoD document. The Nuts node will not do this. It will get everything from the database. So security-wise, we're assessing it at the same level as your server has been compromised, and access to private keys might also be possible. So then it's on the same level as the security measures for any other DoD method.
I think we have.
Yeah, so I saw the question about the multiple vendors. Yeah. I can go back to the specific sheet. From the working group results. As you can see here, on the left side, there's one organization and it has 2 vendors. So it has 2 Nuts nodes. You see 2 arrows going in, which says legal basis. So basically, that organization has some kind of source for the legal basis of data transfer. all vendors that provide services for that organization should have access to the same service. So it's all being done in the context of a care organization. So you probably have to address different APIs. Also note that you could use the OAuth flow we defined with, for example, just an organization credential to access APIs from different vendors within the context of a same organization. Does this answer your question, Jort?
I think so, but I would like to just do it once to just execute the whole sequence to see it for myself.
Yeah, so the question for your use case would be, where does the post/authorize with request and params go to?
And yeah, and how does it, because in the presentation definition, we need to present the organization credential. So how does it actually get it? Because now it's only issued by the vendor, but you want two vendors of the same organization to use the same organization credential, right?
Yeah, so you could, in this flow, you could define a same organization use case, right? And your policy backend would then list a presentation definition with an organization credential.
Mm-hmm.
And when checking the actual, you could also already check something when issuing the access token, but that would make your access token issuance use case specific. So on the post authorize, so if you're requesting resources from DID A, and A has the same organization credential as DID B, then this policy backend can just say, yes, you're requesting the same, you're requesting data from an organization that has the exact same verified credential, organization credential, as you used in getting your access token.
Yeah, I know, but how does it get the same organization credential?
Issuance, for example, should not be done by the vendor. So getting an organization credential should be something that has to be done by the government. So we're lobbying for that. But basically the flow would be, you provide a environment for your customer. So the vendor provides an environment for the organization, for the care organization, and it provides a login for the system administrator, for example. The system administrator sets up all the user accounts, but there should also be a button somewhere that says, activate this environment for data exchange in the Netherlands. That should forward you to a portal from example, the CIBG. There you log in with an e-herkenningmiddel. And there you click on approve, and then you're done.
Yeah, I know, but yeah, but this could be, yeah, it could take like up to 6 to 12 months more before we have national issuers.
So,
But in the meantime, we can still
yeah.
use the Nuts organization credentials.
So currently we have the trust list in the Nuts node, where you have to manually trust all the other vendors.
Yeah.
We'll basically put all those vendor DIDs in the presentation definition. And we can just publish the presentation definition. Then everybody can see which vendors we should agree on. You can check for yourself if the URLs are correct. You can also check it on Slack, discuss it with each other. And everybody has to configure the same presentation definition.
Okay, cool.
That means that the configuration for a use case will just be presentation definition and the use case controller. We'll probably put that in the same file. So there won't be any need for the Trust API anymore. Okay. Given all this changes, because it's a lot, you're also allowed to take 7 days to think about it, come back next meeting on next Tuesday and start asking a lot of questions. That will be the second session. So we have already come up with 5 steps for migration. The first step would be to migrate from using Nuts authorization credential to the policy backend, because this does not require any update to the Nuts Node software. It only requires an update in the AAA proxy for every vendor, where when a resource request comes in, it has to check if this corresponds to the access token. It then has to do an extra step. It has to contact some kind of backend to see if that specific resource may be accessed by that party. So for example, if you have an original source for the Nuts authorization credentials, that original source just has to have an API, and then you should be able to call that API. That would be the first step. We have already interviewed a single vendor, and if I'm not mistaken, 2 more should have already been scheduled, because we're going to see how different vendors have implemented this for certain use cases, and see if there are a lot of vendors that would potentially have a problem with this, and maybe we can create some open source software to help in this process. So that would be 1A and 1B.
That's a good question from Sergey.
Okay, so I see someone looking at the question from Sergey. So when looking at this from a governance perspective, the current agreement stays in place until all issuers that generate the basic trust between nodes are fulfilled outside of our own network, and then we can let go of the connection agreement. Yes, this is true, I guess. You are no longer obliged to join a current network. All governance would go through specific use cases. So if the use case says you have to use a system that uses OpenID for VP and DID web, etc., then you have to follow that part. Of course. So we'll still be creating RFCs. And for certain use cases, you still have to adopt those RFCs. There will be way less RFCs from our end because we'll be adopting the international standards. Okay. So that's step 1. Step 2 would be to migrate from the registry to the use case list. This would require a Nuts node update. Ryan already started on writing the RFC for the use case list. And I think implementation will also start shortly. Then we also have to decide who's going to be a controller for different use cases, and we have to decide where to publish those presentation definitions, or actually the configuration for different use cases. When that's done, each vendor just has to update their configuration for specific use cases, and the Nuts node will do the rest. And we'll also make sure that the current search APIs will be rerouted to use the new updated database. Then we'll start work on the revocation list. And when that's done, we can stop publishing the different credentials on the network. So we also have to monitor that the version that implements the status list is deployed by everyone. And as soon as it's deployed by everyone, we can stop publishing the different credentials on the network. The only thing that will be published on the network after step 3 will be the Nuts DIDs. Step 4 would be, and I'm just going to update this during the presentation. Would be migrating to DID web. And to help in the process is we can reissue all organization credentials that are currently issued to Nuts DIDs and issue them to web DIDs. And then step 5 would be updating the user flow. And this is a bit uncertain how it will go. Basically, this would be the implementation for OpenID for VP, which depend on user authentication means. Will already be like a lot of months in the future, and maybe there should be some clarity on which authentication means can actually be used. And after that, there are probably some other steps we have to do as well. And if we look at this on a timeline, DID web support has already been added, DID JWK support as well. We're just about to start work on the use case list implementation. And after that, we'll do the revocation status list. The little red dot on the right would indicate that the Nuts node would be ready to do everything the new way. So that would be very interesting for use cases that start somewhere around that point in time. You can just start using all the new stuff and don't worry about any migrations. Everything that's already being used will have to migrate. Let's see. Okay, this will be the timeline, and my next slide will be notes. To take notes from you guys. Are there any more questions we need to answer? I see. What are the current most promising means in development? You mean authentication means? Yeah, so there's one thing for certain, and that's AEDAS 2 and the architectural reference framework. So the European Union is just going forward. Every nation has to provide a free wallet for all their inhabitants. It's a bit unclear what the timeline will be, but the Dutch wallet is already in development. So there's a lot of stuff that's being done that it's mandatory. The question just is there anything available next year, or will it be later? Another question would be, are care organizations already accepting all the new means next year, or are they still trying to postpone everything? So that makes it a bit uncertain on what is happening. We are already experimenting with open source wallets that support some kind of draft version of all those specifications. And the first results are promising. Even with draft versions of specifications, we can already use those open source wallets. So if you go to the future 6 months, there will be less changes to all those specifications, and the open source wallets will probably be more interoperable than they are now. Let's see if there are more questions. Yeah, so there seem to be more steps for migration than indicated in the timeline. What is the plan for those? Yeah, so uncertain. So steps 1, 2, 4, 5 could actually be done after the red dot. Some of them could be done before that. So, for example, step 1 can already start now. But for example, step 4 and 5 will have to be done after the red dot. There's a question from Jort. A sharper view on the timeline, which probably means, can you put some kind of quarter indication and year on each dot? I see some nodding. No, and it also depends on how much capacity we have. We know now that, for example, use case list and verification status list can probably be done this year. The new OAuth flows, for example, an OpenID for VP. We already have something working with an open source wallet. So we know that stuff can work, but it doesn't mean that it's production ready. So for the OAuth flows, I would certainly say something like quarter 2 of next year. And then the rest is after that. The takeaway about all the things we're doing, that it's going towards things that everybody in the world is doing. And that makes the future less uncertain than it is now using our own standards. Okay, so this is it. I think, like Tim said, it's a lot to take in. Of course, all these little dots will probably be in contact with almost everybody, almost all vendors, to see how things go. Are new versions being installed? We'll be testing it a lot, of course, on the development and stable networks, and just make it a very interactive process.
Question from Jort. What is wise when specifying new use case specs?
Yeah, I'll read it since your microphone is off. What is wise when specifying new use case specifications? I hope to start working on open EHR with Nuts and want to finish the BGZ referral with Nuts in a few months. Is it wise to already start including presentation definitions and policy refs in the new specifications? For the BGZ, because it's already beyond test, I think it would be discouraged to migrate now, unless all participating vendors say, oh, this is way simpler, and I can wait for a month and or 2 months and then use the new stuff. It would make me much more happy. But for the open EHR, I would say use the new definitions. So I think there's a lot of work there to do for what kind of queries, what is the information model, what are your functional requirements, can you just steal a presentation definition from a different use case, or just have a really simple one and just start with that. And be in contact with us if you have any questions, I guess. I see some nodding from Jorrit, so I guess he agrees.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? You can also ask a question live. Hugo has a question. Will all of these changes be implemented in the existing node? And will there be backwards compatibility for the existing functionality? Yes, that was the idea. And what was the timeline for phasing out the old stuff? What is the responsibility of migrating of the vendors? For the use case list with the A overdraft, does everyone have to go over at the same time, or can you just use them side by side? So our goal is always to have minimal impact and not have a big migration party at Friday evening, 11 o'clock or something. For example, for the use case list, we can use two different sources for the registry. One is the use case list, and the other one is just the network. The Nuts network will be operational until all of these features are in use by all of the vendors. So the Nuts network is the backup, and it will be shut down after everybody has migrated. So that means that you still get all the information about DIDs, published credentials, revocations, and all that kind of stuff. Does that answer your question, Hugo? Yeah. Okay, so I have one question for all of you, which is a very generic question. How does this feel, between quotes? Do you think it's the right way forward? Do you see a lot of work ahead? What do you think? And you can just start talking or raise a hand if you want.
Maybe I can go first, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, to me, it feels like quite impactful changes, and without giving enough context on when they happen, I started to have my doubts about we are doing the EOFdracht test matrix, and is that even still the I was starting to think, is that even still smart to do that, or do we have to test everything again anyway? But based on the last part of the presentation, a lot of this seems like stuff for the future, and we can still use the existing use cases. So I guess that's still is relevant. But I mean, if you don't give that context, I started to think, are we gonna have to retest everything soon anyway? So, but that was the feeling that came to me. But from what I can understand, we can still just continue with the EOFdracht as is for now still. But yeah, seems pretty impactful to me, at least.
Yeah, so overdraft is one of the use cases that's already pretty far. So the idea that we had was to interview each vendor to see how they currently administer the overdraft. So what kind of database does each vendor have set up for the overdraft? For example, all resource URLs in the composition, do you already have them in a database somewhere? Or do you have to create something from scratch? Because that defines the impact for that specific use case. So we're trying to make it as smooth as possible. And especially for a overdraft, we're trying to schedule an interview with each and every one of you.
Okay, sounds good. Then the only thing I would like is to see the new stuff in action for a new use case, I guess. That would give me more understanding of every specific thing. But for the rest, it's good.
Yeah, you can also expect us when stuff comes ready to integrate it in our own demo. So you get also some code examples of how it should work and where the responsibilities lie for checking authorizations.
Okay, that's would be helpful.
Tim, do you want to ask the question live, or do you want me to read it out loud?
I guess I can. I'm in a office space with more people, but sure. it wasn't really a question, it was more a suggestion. If the use case list is basically discovery service, then maybe just call it discovery service. Also to make it clear that it has no role in the actual transaction between care organizations. In that sense, it's not a central service or a man in the middle, it's just discovery service.
Yeah, so as you saw, there's a working title in parentheses behind the use case list. So
Yeah, hence the suggestion.
yeah, discovery service is already a better name. We didn't do a come up with a good name session yet, so for now, discovery service would be above the use case list.
You're welcome.
So now we have a network. So each vendor has his own Nuts node, and yeah, we have to manually trust each other. Actually, yeah, now it looks like that the network is then gone in the new version. Or yeah, maybe like end of next year or whatever. And they say you don't have to trust each other anymore. It's all in some sort of use case list. But how is that then? Yeah. How is this use case updated? Is this on GitHub and you have to put it next to your Nuts node to have something like that? Or?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. You could say that it's about the presentation definition and also the controller URL. So who is going to act as a central controller for distributing all the participants, and who is defining that specific presentation definition. You could say, if you look at how use cases should be developed, that, for example, there is a couple or some other collaboration in care that gives the assignment for the development of a specific use case. And they also select the party that helps in defining the use case. So who is maintaining all the documentation, who is in contact, who is the project lead of the next version, who is in contact with all the vendors, who's organizing all the meetings, etc., etc., etc. So that's a very specific role that should be fulfilled for each use case. And if you look to the overdracht, that role is currently split up over different parties. For example, from the Nuts community, we're organizing the Bolt meetings, and we also have the technical documentation, but we do not have the information model documentation that lies with Nictis. So eventually you want something for the overdracht use case that it is all combined, and that there's also a wiki on where to get help, who to hire, whatever, to help to implement it. And that should also be the place where this presentation definition and the controller is listed as this is the definition you should use. With, of course, a little line that says, please also check if all the issuers are known to you and if you trust them, etc., etc. Until that is actually the result, we'll probably put the presentation definition and the controller URL next to the Bolt documentation. That documentation also has to be transferred to another party. So I already contacted Nictis. They have a product owner for overdracht, asking them if they are going to host all this documentation, and then they could probably also host this presentation definition and controller URL to define who joined the use case. Maybe they even want to link it to the test results with their test server. So if you're qualified, they can add your DID to that list, for example. Until that happens, we'll probably put it in, I think, chapter 6 or something from the Bolt documentation. And then you can also see that it has been added to GitHub and who added it and that kind of stuff. So also, as soon as the DoD web DDs are in there, it's easier to actually check if you trust them or not. I saw another question from Jorrit. If I look at from a bigger distance, it looked like it becomes less nuts and more generic. Yes, this is true. That's one of the benefits of using global standards. It will be way easier to actually hire people to help you out. And it also connects better to the understanding of most of the developers. So all the developers that already know a lot about OAuth, and they would be much easier for them to also integrate these specific things, the specific profiles for Dutch healthcare. And hopefully more will help out, of course. Are there any other questions or answers to my question?
Yeah, I have an answer to your question. I think from the Hink perspective, what you just proposed does help resolve a lot of sort of growing pains we noticed. Although I do have to say that I feel like I should read up more on the underlying specs in order to have a better understanding of what it exactly means, of how it will work in the future for us.
Yeah, I think from the Hink perspective, the fact that you could query a consent store as policy backend would help in some of your use cases, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay, so we only have 10 minutes left. So if there are no further questions, I would propose that everybody gave it some thought. I can share the presentation in Slack, so you can read up on the things listed there. We do not have any more documentation on specifics. Even if you get further to the right of the timeline, there will be less documentation. As I said earlier, DoD web support is already there. Use case list RFC is being drafted as we speak. And we also almost completed the OAuth flow RFC for server-to-server communication, so where there's no medical data involved and no user involved, because that's still something that's not in the new standards. Revocation status list is just a global standard. You can read up on that for yourself. Yeah, so if you come up with any good questions, you could join the session from next week. You can also ask them on Slack, and we'll probably discuss them next week as well. And this entire meeting will be posted online. Maybe this week, maybe next week. Any final thoughts, comments? Otherwise, I will just end the meeting. Your last question, when will the first hackathon be organized? When it's done. When there's something to hack. Okay, that's it. Thank you for attending, and see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.